I want to welcome you back to our ongoing exploration of Acts facts, a Jewish journey through the book of Acts. Just a brief reminder of what we covered last week. Previously in Acts facts, we saw Peter come back from Caesarea and his sojourn with Cornelius, the Gentile God-fearer, who is now not just a God-fearer, but a brother in Messiah. We saw him face opposition for the choices that he made, and ultimately nobody could argue with the fact that God had accepted Gentiles as Gentiles without them first having to become Jews to become believers and brothers and sisters within the church, within the congregation of believers. So we moved quickly to Antioch. We moved north of Israel, and we went to Syria to Antioch, and we explored what was going on in Antioch. And Antioch is going to be a headquarters that we'll see for a good portion of the faith throughout the rest of the book of Acts. Barnabas went to explore what was going on in Antioch. You remember that Gentiles were coming to faith there too. And so Barnabas came to see if this was kosher. And he gave a report back to the apostles in Jerusalem that it was indeed kosher, and realized after some time that he needed some help leading this mixed group of Jewish and Gentile believers in Antioch. And he ran to Tarsus, where we last left our friend Saul. And Saul came and accompanied Barnabas and led the congregation in Antioch with Barnabas, co-leaders together. And that's where we left our events. Let's now return to Jerusalem. We left with a summary of a prophecy of famine and raising money for the Jerusalem church, and Barnabas and Paul being sent as a delegation. That's, in a sense, that's jumping forward a little bit. We'll see at the end of this chapter, we'll reconnect to the end of chapter 11. We're going back now 3 years. We traced the growth of the Antioch church. Now Luke is catching us up on what we missed in Jerusalem. So we go back a few years to the year 44 AD. 44 AD, some 9 years after Saul's initial persecution of the church in 35 AD. We're going to see some opposition to the church, to the congregation in Jerusalem again. But it comes not from the source from which it came previously, which was the religious hierarchy in Jerusalem, but it comes from a new source this time. The recently appointed Jewish king, Herod Agrippa I. Now, verse 1, chapter 12. About that time, Herod the king laid hands, not in a good way, laid hands on some who belonged to the church in order to mistreat them. And here's a big blow. It's only one verse. Its impact is, don't mistake the brevity for a lack of impact. This is a huge matzo ball that the church had to endure. Verse 2. And he had James, the brother of John, one of the 12 apostles, put to death with a sword. Why? Out of nowhere, what precipitated this persecution? Well, a widespread Jewish antagonism, perhaps, widespread Jewish antagonism to the church's recent policy of incorporating Gentiles into their sect. Previously, up until Peter and Cornelius, 4 years earlier, The only way a Gentile had received an invitation to any Jewish party was through the detachment of his foreskin. The church's new cocktail of mixed Jews and Gentiles was not going down smoothly in Jerusalem. And the city of Jerusalem was both shaken and stirred. Let's take a biographical moment and find out, who is this Herod Agrippa I? Who is this guy? He's the grandson of Herod the Great. You remember Herod the Great is the one who built the temple, the one who commanded the slaughter of the children, the babies in Bethlehem when Yeshua was born. He's the Herod Agrippa I is the nephew of Herod Antipas, who is the Herod who participated at the time of Yeshua's crucifixion. Herod Agrippa I had a 7-year reign, began in 37, ended in 44. We're in the year 44, by the way, so you can draw your conclusions as to what the outcome is going to be, what kind of a year this will be for Herod Agrippa I. They moved the capital. You know, I've spent some time showing you the beautiful palace of Herod in Caesarea. They moved the capital back to Jerusalem from Caesarea. Herod Agrippa I spent a good portion of his younger days in Rome. He was educated there. And Caligula was a friend, Claudius. They appointed Agrippa king of all Israel. King of all Israel. There's a period of time when, after Herod Antipas, that there was no king. Now there is king, and it's a unified king over not just Galilee, not just Judea, but all of Israel. And as I have mentioned now twice, he has an untimely death in this very year, in the year 44 AD. So this is what this man looked like, Herod Agrippa I. There's a beautiful profile of him on a coin. And just FYI, you know the Herodian rulers that we have here. We have Herod the Great, Herod Antipas, Herod Agrippa, and Herod Agrippa II. We see them here laid out in a beautiful chart as they are mentioned in the Gospels in the book of Acts. If you're a more visual person, here's a little family tree, Herod the Great, and you see Herod Agrippa I breaks down off of Herodias and her husband. So we'll follow the children, at least 2 children of Herod the Agrippa I, later on, many, many months from now, toward the end of the book of Acts. Well, when Herod Agrippa I saw that executing James, cutting off his head, pleased the Jews, a real crowd pleaser, right? Persecution of the church, why? Was it instigated by the king? Well, did he merely approve the will of the Sanhedrin? Under Agrippa, the Sanhedrin could finally carry out that which it couldn't do previously, the sentence of capital punishment. When we explored that, when we looked at the crucifixion of Yeshua, how they had to grovel to Rome to request and manipulate the death of Yeshua, because they didn't have capital punishment as one of their authorities. But now, under Agrippa I, under a king, they don't have to run to Rome to first officially plead their case. I think the most likely scenario that we're dealing with here is that Agrippa and the Sanhedrin orchestrated together, hand in hand, the persecution that they exhibited. And the first action that they take is as decisive as it is brutal. Not just one of the 12, but one of the inner circle of Yeshua's friends, one of the 3, James, brother of John, one of Jesus' most intimate companions, was arrested and beheaded, decapitation, arguably the most merciful form of approved Jewish capital punishment. You may argue, but I don't know, I'd prefer decapitation to stoning, or to burning, or to strangulation. Those are all the 4 approved methods. Indicates that he had been charged under Jewish law with apostasy. So one of the sons of thunder was prematurely silenced, the first apostle to die. Brother John, going to be the last to die, the only apostle to die as an old man of natural causes. And although James and John are really, they're central in the Gospels, including the Gospel of Luke, that Luke wrote, here in Acts, Luke places both James and John on the periphery. Right? It's the only other mention of James in the narrative besides the list of apostles at the very beginning in chapter 1. But now we move, in contrast to the briefest of summaries regarding what happened to James, the fate of James, Luke is more expansive here in relaying the details of Peter's arrest. So he saw that James, executed James, please, as a smash hit, standing room only. How do you follow that crowd pleaser up? He prepared an encore. He arrested Peter also. And just so you know the context, it's during the days of unleavened bread. Why is that important? Knowing when this is. Because it is Feast of Unleavened Bread, Passover, in other words. It's one of the 3 pilgrimage holidays when Jews from around the world are present in Jerusalem. And so if you're going to maximize your audience, you certainly want to swell your crowds for this 8-day celebration. So, the tide of the Jewish population's favorable attitude toward the church had turned, bloom, off the rose. No matter how many people Peter and company healed, no matter how many people were exorcised by Peter and the congregation. So here we are at Passover week 44 AD, 11 years following the arrest, trial, and execution of Yeshua. The way Luke is setting the narrative, Peter is very much following in the footsteps of his mentor and Lord. How many times have we seen Peter imprisoned already in the book of Acts? Well, this is time number 3, right? Now, in light, you'll remember what happened last time. In light of Peter and company's notorious escape from his previous imprisonment, now that by this time is like almost a decade earlier, right? Or maybe it's a decade earlier. Agrippa is going to allocate an extraordinary, kind of absurd amount of security for Peter. It's a quantity of guarding usually reserved for the most dangerous of prisoners. King's going to take no chances with what he hoped to be the crowning spectacle of the holiday season. And maybe, just maybe, the death blow to this Nazarene aberrant movement. So here we have the crowds gathered together, one of the 3 times of the year. What are the other 2 times? Tabernacles, and we saw in Acts 2, Pentecost, right? Shavuot. When he had seized him, watch the amount of people. He put him in prison, delivering him to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out before the people. So around the clock at all hours. 2 guards are personally chained to Peter, and 2 more stationed immediately in front of his cell. It's a rotation every 24 hours. You get 4 of these groups. So we change 4 times in the course of a day. 4 squads, each squad made up of 4 men. Not looking good for Peter. It seems inevitable that Peter is about to suffer the same fate as had James. Peter's days are numbered, synchronized to the conclusion of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But Luke lets us know that passionate and continuous prayer was being made for Peter by the church. So Peter is arrested. He's kept under guard. There's 2 potential locations where Peter was kept. One on the left-hand side is the palace of Herod himself. However, more likely is the Antonia fortress on the right-hand side, directly attached to the northwest corner of the temple compound itself. So this is another image of what the Antonia looked like. You see it overlooks the courtyard of the Gentiles and the temple courts. Peter is most likely somewhere imprisoned in this building here, the Antonia fortress, by 16 of these guys, the Roman guards. Peter was kept in prison, but prayer for him was being made fervently by the church to God. Well, sometimes prayer makes a difference. Sometimes our prayers are not answered in the way that we are hoping. I wonder what will be the case for Peter. On the very night, the 8th and final evening, in other words, of the combined festivals of Passover and unleavened bread, the evening prior to Peter's execution the next morning, on the very night when Herod was about to bring him forward for execution, Peter was sleeping. Now, that by itself should arrest your attention. On the night before his execution, Peter's sleeping. Let's not let a little thing like executions get in the way of a good night's rest. Peter's sleeping. But he's not just sleeping, he's sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound to them with 2 chains, and 2 guards in front of the door. We're watching over the prison. I find this actually kind of marvelous. The apostle is soundly asleep in his cell, flanked by 2 guards, to which his arms are chained, watched by 2 additional guards on the other side of the prison door. Peter knew what happened to his friend James. But Peter is evidently not too apprehensive. Maybe he was trusting in the Lord's promise. Remember at the end of John that Peter would not be executed until he had reached an old age. Peter probably realizes that he's probably got 10, 20 more years coming to him, but of course, no guarantee. Here we have the kind of prison that Peter would have been in. It's the exterior of the prison, and a light shines. Behold, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared, and a light shone in the cell. He struck Peter's side and woke him up. Peter's sleeping. An angel materialized, accompanied by a bright light. Now, in most movies, or TV programs, when you see this, you hear a little music cue, and an angel appears, and the light is very bright, and whoever's sleeping pops awake, right? It's a great moment. Not Peter. Sound sleeper. Clear conscience. So the angel dramatically appears, the light dramatically shines, no reaction from Peter. Well, the guards, apparently the guards at this point had either been put into a sleep or a stupor, but the angel appears, sees that he gets no reaction from the sleeping apostle, realizes that he needs to interrupt the apostle's slumber. Get up, sleepyhead, and gives him what's called here in the Greek patasso. Patasso is what we would say in Yiddish, a good zetz, a hard push, a heavy blow on the side to wake him up. This angel's not messing around, right? There's no, Petey, time to wakey. No, gives him a boom, up. It's an angel after all. It's got places to go, things to do. And perhaps blinking in the bright light of the angel, Peter stumbles to his feet, and when he does, the chains fall off his hands. Look, he struck Peter's side, woke him up saying, get up quickly, and Peter gets up and his chains fall right off his hands as he arose. And the angel, I think this is fair enough, the angel commands him to throw on his clothes because they're about to make a quick getaway. The angel said to him, gird yourself. And don't forget your sandals, right? Because we're making a getaway. Don't do that. You don't want to do this in your underwear, right? Make sure you're dressed for going out. And he did so. And he said to him, wrap your cloak around you. It's cold. I'm not going to rescue you and then have you catch your death of cold. So Peter follows the angel out. He went out, continued to follow. But here's Peter's mindset. He didn't know that what was being done by the angel was real. Thought he was seeing a vision. Who could blame him? First of all, he's a deep sleeper. But number two, we know that it was in sleep, in a comatose state, up on the roof in Simon the Tanner's, that Peter had that triple vision of the sheet being low. So Peter thinks he's seeing a vision. It's actually not really happening in real time. He makes his way into the night air. When they had passed the first and the second guard, they came to the iron gate that leads into the city, which opened for them by itself. Now, usually, in a horror film, any door that opens by itself is really scary. And you're supposed to be all nervous and anxious. This is not that kind of scene. This is exciting and happy and quite a holy adventure. And the iron gate, this intimidating force, a barrier that would keep Peter from freedom, it's nothing to the Lord or to his angel. And it opens by itself. And they went out and went along one street. And immediately the angel departed from him. Think about how miraculous this is. Think about how anomalous this is. Inexplicably, Peter encounters no resistance from any Roman soldiers. And then the iron gate to the imposing Antonia fortress now automatically opens of its own accord for Peter and the angel. And Peter gets out on the street. As soon as Peter achieves his freedom, the angel who escorted Peter takes him one street down the length of one street and disappears. And hailing the evening air, Peter snaps out of his daze. Make this nighttime and you get the picture, okay? There they are. They've gotten out of the iron door. Peter came to himself. He snaps to himself. and realizes, this is not a dream. This is not a vision. It's really happening. Now I know, he said. Now I know for sure that the Lord has sent forth his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting. Once again, Peter was miraculously rescued. It's getting to be a habit with him. This, of course, is going to be hugely disappointing to King Herod Agrippa and the Jewish bloodthirsty population who were enthusiastically looking forward to the apostles' execution that next morning. When he realized this, he pinched himself. I don't know what he did. When he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, mother of John is called Mark. We're going to talk about John Mark in a moment. Where many were gathered together and were praying. Peter realizes that although he was able to escape, nonetheless, he needed to hide. He needed to go underground, skip town, away from the eyes of Agrippa. And before he does so, he wants to alert the church as to what happened. And he knows that there are people praying on his behalf in the home of Mary, mother of John Mark. And before fleeing Jerusalem for safer territory, he stealthily makes his way through the dark city streets to where the believers are gathered to inform them of what God had done. Makes his way up through the alleys and the streets of old Jerusalem. This is a bigger picture of what those alleys and streets, bird's eye view, and to the home, specifically, of Mary. Now notice, by the way, notice the streets, right? You see the home. Homes have a courtyard in the middle of the home, and they are square in nature, and you've got streets on either side. That's the external area of the home. And then people will be praying on, most likely, this is the home, by the way, where the upper room was. This is the home where they were meeting in chapter 1 to decide who is going to replace Judas. This is that area. There's an upper room, and that's most likely where they're praying. At least an internal, one of the rooms that are internal is where they are meeting to pray. Let's talk for a moment and do another biographical session. John Mark, might as well, since we mentioned him, we might as well introduce him here and get to know him a little bit. He's a supporting player in the lives of Barnabas and Saul and Peter. That's why it's good to introduce him now. His name in Hebrew, Yochanan, God is gracious. His Latin name is Marcus. He possibly held Roman citizenship, I think it's likely. He appears not only here in the Acts narrative, but in the epistles as well. And John Mark, is the guy who composed the gospel that preserved the recollections and teachings of Peter. We call it the Gospel of Mark, but that's what the Gospel of Peter is. And Peter indicates that he actually is the one who led Mark to faith. He calls him my son. That's generally what that means. And he's most likely, in Mark, it's the only time in any of the Gospels where this particular story is mentioned. You have an anonymous young man wearing nothing but a sheet. He's not a KKK member. He's not playing a ghost. He flees naked, and he escapes arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus is arrested by the Roman soldiers, by the temple guard. So that's John Mark. So back to the home of Mary, one of the central meeting places for the Jerusalem church, regular location of assembly. Remember, we're dealing with house churches at this time. And so most likely the larger homes, that are possessed by some of the members. If you have a larger home, it's just more convenient to have your meetings there. And this is the area that served as apostolic headquarters following Jesus' death. We have seen now John Mark. Let's get back into the narrative, which I find, actually, I'm a guy who enjoys humorous narrative. And this is purposely written as a really absurd, humorous narrative. A lot of humor in the Bible. If you're reading KJV, sometimes it's hard to catch it. But if you know the context, it's quite enjoyable to see what's intended and how God works and how God's people work. People are people with their human eccentricities. So, Peter, remember, has made his way through the darkened streets, hiding in the shadows, hugging up against the walls of the home, staying in the shadows, avoiding anyone being able to track him from the Antonian fortress under pain of execution. And he finally arrives at the home of Mary, and he knocks at the door of the gate. And a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. When she recognized Peter's voice, now watch what's happening here, right? She peers across the darkened courtyard. You remember how the homes are set up. Peter is, let's say he's on that end right there, okay? And he's knocking on that door. Rhoda is inside. She hears the knocking. Nobody from the interior in their meeting, fervently praying for Peter's release from prison and God's mercy. Nobody else hears it, but Rhoda hears it. She peers across the darkened courtyard, but she is unable to make out the shadow. It's dark. She can't make out the shadowy figure standing behind the locked gate. But she does recognize Peter's distinctive voice. And Peter is requesting entry. And Rhoda is so overwhelmed with joy that without first crossing the courtyard to actually open the door and let him in, she's so excited, it's Peter, she runs back inside to inform the believers, which leaves Peter standing there. Look at this. When she recognized Peter's voice because of her joy, she did not open the gate. That's funny. Ran in and announced that Peter is standing in front of the gate. Meanwhile, Peter is standing there, still vulnerable and hugging the wall, and nobody's giving him shelter. But more humor ensues. Human nature. So Rhoda comes in and says, Peter's outside! Your prayers are answered! And they said to her, you're out of your mind. You're nuts! You're loony! For a group that's devoting themselves to all-night prayer session, this reaction, I think, is a little bit puzzling. Undoubtedly, certain doubts had crept in whether God is going to accomplish on Peter's behalf what he chose not to do on James' behalf. Nonetheless, Rhoda is continually asserting, insisting it is Peter, and they're saying, no, it's not, you're nuts. Finally they say, well, maybe it's his angel. Where does this come from? Common Jewish belief held at that time that each person had a guardian angel assigned to him or her who at any time might assume human appearance, occasionally the human appearance that the angel can assume would be the person to which he's a guardian. So it's not Peter, it's just an angel. But even if it's an angel, wouldn't you want to run and see what does this angel look like? And I haven't met an angel. Not only have I not had a date with an angel, I haven't ever met an angel. I'd be very interested. I'd be curious to find out who is or is not standing in front of the gate. But while they're arguing, it's not, it's the angel, what? Peter is still outside, and he's still knocking. Peter continued knocking. Finally, his persistence paid off, and the group takes a break from their mini shouting match as to who is impossible for it to be and who it might be. Finally, they rush to the front door to see who's knocking and disturbing their peace so loudly in the middle of the night. They opened the door, they saw him, and they were amazed. Why were they amazed? They've been praying for just this thing. They've been praying for just this. But recognizing that Peter, not a figment of Rhoda's imagination, not an angel, they invite him in. And Peter, motioning to them with his hand to be silent, he described to them how the Lord had led him out of the prison. And he said, report these things to James and the brethren. Pass it on, in other words. And then he left. And mysteriously, Luke tells us, he went to another place. Where? Where did Peter go? Another place. Couldn't you be more specific than that? He could have been, I guess. If he told us, he'd have to kill us. I don't know. He left and he went to another place. Peter is, after this point, is going to disappear from the narrative. Central figure is going to disappear because he went to another place. He's going to return, chapter 15, for a guest starring cameo appearance. Chapter 15, when it comes time to make an official ruling as to what are we really going to do with all these Gentiles and how do they really fit in? But for all intents and purposes, this is Peter's last hurrah. He went to another place. The episode that we've just seen raises the matter as to why God chose to rescue the apostle Peter, but he chose not to rescue the apostle James. It's a question that has no ready answer except to affirm the scriptural record that from our perspective, God sometimes acts what we would consider to be inconsistently and certainly unpredictably according to his great sovereign will and purpose. It is God's prerogative to act as he deems best, whether or not it accords with our own opinions or desires or hopes. One lesson that can be construed from God's dealings with both believers and unbelievers in Acts is that although God's character is immutable, in other words, who God is morally, ethically, as a character, his character is unchangeable. Nonetheless, he refuses to be confined to a box or to one inflexible pattern of behavior. The moment that you think you can predict what God is going to do, or more interestingly, that you can tell God what to do, is the moment that you're in for a surprise. And God answers prayer always, but not always in the way that we hope he will. When we're looking for a yes, sometimes God gives us a yes, but sometimes he gives us a no. And sometimes with that no, there is no explanation, no footnote, no end note that will qualify the reason for the no. Sometimes there's a yes, sometimes there's a no. And sometimes there's, yeah, wait a while, not yet. Not yet. Keep praying for what you're praying. I'll give you an answer in time. A month, a year, 20 years, 40 years. Don't get tired of praying for something that God has not yet answered. Some of us pray our entire lives for things that God has not answered. Some of us, we've been praying for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Something God hasn't said no, but He has said yes. So we keep praying. Now, this week, in the months to come, we're going to look at a place like Afghanistan, which is still, it's absorbing everybody's thoughts and prayers. I hope your prayers. And why were some killed in a suicide blast the other day and others not? Why were some injured? There'll be times coming up when believers, maybe Americans as well, will be killed, and some will not. Some will be saved, some will not be saved. Some Christians in Afghanistan will be martyred. Some will find new lives in other nations, America and some of the European and other areas. Some will flee to the hills and remain in the hills for the next few years. Why doesn't God uniformly answer if we're praying for the protection of our American citizens and our U.S. military in Afghanistan? Why doesn't God just immediately check yes? Why does He preserve some and not preserve the other? Why will some believers in Afghanistan be rescued? Why will some be martyred? This is the same issue that we deal with here in the book of Acts. Why was James executed? Was he not in the inner circle? Was he not one of three of Yeshua's best friends? The answer, yes, James, John, Peter. Why was he the first apostle to be executed, to be killed? Why does John, his brother, live a long life? Last apostle to die of natural causes. It's because it's God's sovereign will. I can't dictate to God. You can't dictate to God what His will, how His will is going to be exercised. We trust and we pray and we put our faith in the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the God who is the Father of our Lord, Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus, our Messiah. Well, I don't want to move on from here. Simply, I will conclude the passage. When day came, there was no small disturbance, which actually I love as a phrase. There's no small disturbance. That means there was a really big to-do, right? Luke uses this phrase several times in the book of Acts. No small, he says, Tarsus, no small city, right? There's no, which means Tarsus is a big honking city, right? No small disturbance, a big giant hoopla or in Hebrew, a chupla, among the soldiers. Remember how many soldiers were guarding him, right? There were 4 at any given time. No small disturbance among the soldiers as to what could have become of Peter. Right? So upon daybreak, Peter has done a Houdini. Once again, he's disappeared from his cell. He's managed to give the authorities the slip. The guard had every right to be highly agitated because Peter's disappearance literally puts the soldiers' lives on the line. Agrippa's not pleased that his plans for a stunning holiday finale, a real crowd pleaser, a rip-roaring finale, that those plans had been thwarted. Here's daybreak, and Peter's cell is empty. When Herod had searched for him and had not found him, systematic search, but unsuccessful search, Agrippa continued his investigation. How? By interrogating the guards. And thoroughly disgusted, dissatisfied, frustrated with what he, Agrippa, learned, Agrippa took those 4 guards and he ordered their execution, which is standard procedure for any Roman soldier who proved unable to discharge his duties. In this case, the simple guarding of a double-chained and locked-up prisoner. The deaths of the guards are collateral damage in response to Agrippa's apostolic persecution. Yet in the familiar words of that great Jewish entertainer, Al Jolson, you ain't seen nothing yet. The execution of 4 Roman guards only prologue to what God has in store for Agrippa himself. He examined the guards, ordered they be led away to execution, and he went down from Judea to Caesarea, and he was spending time there. What will be Herod Agrippa I's fate when he returns from Judea to Caesarea? What will be God's ultimate response for executing one of and threatening another of the apostles? I'm afraid for the time being, I'm going to need to leave you in suspense. We'll pick up the Acts narrative here. We'll find out what happened to Agrippa. We'll find out what happened. The narrative is going to move from Peter because Peter has disappeared to another place. Right? Peter is now off the grid, so to speak. Right? And once we dispense with Agrippa, spoiler alert, we're going to move to our new main character, which will be Saul, as he begins propagating the gospel from Syria and Antioch, moving into the Western Roman world as we know it, reaching not only Jewish people, but Gentiles as well. Exciting times ahead. Make sure your seatbelts are buckled.